Today we're revisiting one of the most popular GPUs of all time, the GTX 1060. We're specifically looking at the 6GB model. Some of you might remember why that's funny, and it's because NVIDIA couldn't stop releasing GTX 1060s. There were at least 5 or 6 that we can remember. There might be more, no one knows. They're out there in the ether somewhere. But we're looking at the 6GB version of the 1060 today, which was the first one that launched, and it launched with an MSRP of $250. Quite a change from today's RTX 3060s at $330 price point, if you can find it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So the 1060 launch was sort of copied with the 1600 series launch, where NVIDIA they stopped themselves, they figured it out, they calmed down, but it started getting a little crazy. There's the 1650, of course, but the 1660 and the 1660 Ti and the 1660 Super started to make things confusing, especially with as little as a couple % difference between some of them. The 1060s, however, came out originally in July of 2016. If you look at the Steam charts, it's still one of the most, actually it's currently the most popular GPU used by Steam's surveyed user base, asterisk on the surveyed part. So in July 2016, there was the 1060 6GB, and then later the 1060 3GB in August of 2016, then the GTX 1060 5GB in December of 2017. That one was weird, but it was targeted at a specific market, which was supposed to be internet cafes and gaming cafes. And then the GTX 1060 6GB with G5X in October 2018. And somewhere in there was a GTX 1060 9GB per second model with some partners. And of course, there were the GTX 1060 mobile units. There might be a couple others that we're forgetting, but those are the main ones. NVIDIA went a little crazy with this card, but again, if you look at the Steam hardware survey, a 9.52% utilization among Steam surveyed users today is pretty good. And in October, that was at 10.9%. It's been higher than that too. And the GTX 1060 has been one of the most ever used GPUs, following in the footsteps of other 60 series cards previously. If you look back at articles that were posted around launch, the card originally sold for $250. It dropped later, as most cards do, and that's where we had more of an issue with the RTX 3060. Like we said in the 3060 review, our stance was basically meh. And it was meh because, as we said in the review, all you have to do right now is put literally any GPU on the market. The specs don't matter. You don't even need to publish specs. Just throw something out there, put a heatsink on it, put a price on it, and poof, it'll disappear. So that's the magic of GPUs today, and that's why the 3060 can be sold so much higher price than the last known MSRP of the 1060. And that's the critical point, is it's not just about the launch MSRP, which by the way was lower, it's also about the last known MSRP, which was lower, a lot lower, closer to $200. And then of course you've got the 2060 in between these two, where the 2060, its last MSRP officially was $300, so still $30 cheaper than the modern 3060s. But the difference at the time of the 1060 was that the Founders Edition was brand new. In fact, it was so new that a room full of press, had to be over 100 people in the media there, were utterly baffled by the name Founders Edition for no less than 1 hour. We legitimately spent the entirety of the technical media and NVIDIA's executive team, including Jensen Huang, the CEO, spent at least an hour talking about the name. So Founders Edition was new, and at the time it was priced higher than the cards that were from partners. And when we published a piece explaining this, it was such a hot topic that we had to post a content piece explaining the name of the card. That's when you know you've made a mistake. Of course, we don't have crazy names today from Intel needs, okay, so maybe there's a few crazy names today. But the GTX 1060 FE, the reason it was confusing was because the name was kind of stupid, and normally it was reference, and that was it. And so then you get this new Legendary Edition card, and it costs more. NVIDIA was trying to position it as a fancy specially built card. It was not technically limited edition, but kind of. And the end result was that if you look back at the MSRP of the 1060 FE and any other 10 series FE card, the MSRP looks higher than it was in reality, because that was the card that launched, that was the price everyone reported, even though later the board partners could come in sometimes $50 or $100 lower. Head-to-head, the many GTX 1060 cards remained mostly within a couple percentage points of each other when we first tested them all, and that was for performance, even the 9 gigabit per second models. The memory capacity wasn't as much of an issue at the time, and this means that the 3 gigabyte card was relegated to the it's fine pile, as in it's okay, or you might as well. But now, of course, the 3 gigabyte model has trouble with some games. Horizon Zero Dawn throws errors if you're below a certain memory capacity, normally 3 gigabytes. Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't really like it once you're on a GTX 970 and below, which is 3.5 gigabytes, sort of. But it's not as bad as the 2 gigabyte GTX 960, where a lot of games just won't even launch or run at certain resolutions, certain game settings, or if they do run, they'll start altering the texture quality and the image quality, so it's not even a like for like. So we're just looking at the 1060 6 gigabyte. It's the most popular from what we can tell. The 3 gigabyte isn't far behind in most games for FPS, but that's because it falls behind in one other aspect that returns a DNF or did not finish result, and that is the ability to launch or run games in a like for like scenario because of the memory capacity reduction for mostly just the modern games. Enough of the history of the 1060, let's get into the benchmarks. We like to start with GTA for these GPU revisits. As we've said before, it's because it's era appropriate. The GTX 1060 came out about a year after GTA 5 on PC, which came out about 2 years after the console launch. So it's a 2015 game for PC from 2013 on console, and that means the 1060 should do better with this one than the other games we test. 1080p testing has the GTX 1060 6 gigabyte model at 92 FPS average, which is actually great performance. That's not totally surprising given the age of the game, but shows the card is still perfectly good for a lot of games out there. There's nothing to feel bad about if you own a 1060 and are happy with its performance. The GTX 1060 led the GTX 960 by 70%, a massive uptick, as a result of the architectural changes in Pascal. Other high performers on the used market might include the GTX 980 Ti or the GTX 1080, but you'd have to shop locally or get really lucky. The RTX 2060 is improved over the 1060, but in this title, it's not to a degree that's necessarily worth it. It'd be more worthwhile for RTX gaming or features like DLSS. 1440p proves it's still playable on the GTX 1060, and that's great news. It won't remain true in modern games, but 60 FPS isn't bad performance. The RTX 2060 provides much more value in these higher resolution scenarios, as does the RTX 3060. It's not quite double the 1060's performance, but it's approaching that. And of course, it's also a little bit more expensive in true MSRP versus MSRP, ignoring all other factors. GTA 5 at 4K is rough, so we'll keep it short. The 1060 did 30 FPS here, and 6 gigabytes was more than enough memory, and even 4 gigabytes on the 960 does okay here, but you can see the choppy behavior in the GTX 960 2 gigabyte to get a better understanding of when and how VRAM limitations become problematic. The real problem is just that the GPU core isn't enough to handle this workload, with the closest capable card being the GTX 1080 or the RTX 2060 at a suboptimal frame rate. Cyberpunk is the newest and most abusive GPU test we're currently running, and given that it's tested on high settings for our standardized bench, it's rough on the GTX 1060. The 1060 ended up at about 34 FPS average, landing just below the RX 580 and not far above the GTX 970. This is one where you'd probably want to upgrade. Settings could be dropped further, but the game starts to look bad pretty fast. We have graphics optimization guides on our channel if you require additional assistance in making some settings choices where you can sacrifice the least visual quality for the most FPS gain. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is up now. In this one, the GTX 1060 6 gigabyte held 63 FPS average, with lows proportionally spaced at 55 and 54 for 1% and 0.1%. That's good performance overall, especially for the 1060, and it shows that it's still fully capable of a lot of modern games at 1080p. 63 FPS average has the card an impressive 68% ahead of the 964 gigabyte, with the modern RTX 3060 at about 2 times the performance of the 1060. That's enough to either move you into higher refresh gaming or to higher resolution gaming, assuming you can find a 3060. If you're looking at a used GTX 1060 6 gigabyte, it's still doing well here. We didn't rerun the 3 gigabyte model, but we recently ran 3.5 gigabyte 970s and 2 gigabyte 960s through, and the most common problem was that a good deal of modern games will either refuse to launch or will potentially silently tank image quality as a result of lower memory capacities, like 3 gigabytes and below, in particular for Horizon Zero Dawn, for example. At 1440p, the GTX 1060 falls down the chart. It's still mostly playable, but in more intense parts of this game, it'll start exhibiting choppy playback. You could drop the settings from our high test settings to balance this, but usually it's easier to just drop the resolution instead. The GTX 1080 shows that it still offers good value here, while the RTX 2060 would provide meaningful uplift and get you into playable territory for many games at 1440p, and a couple at 4K. More modern cards, if found, would get you about a 2 times increase in FPS at the 3060 level, while a used 5700 XT would also offer meaningful uplift. Unfortunately, the current mining market doesn't make the 5700 XT a common find. The 1060 is still doing well overall, and if you can find one used locally, it might be a good option, but only if the pricing supports it. The global market is rough for the GTX 1060. If you're looking at eBay or something, forget about it. We unfortunately saw one go for over $900 on eBay, with the majority of them, from a quick glance, still selling at around the original $300 MSRP from 2016, except in 2021. Shopping your local listings or markets would be the best bet. Maybe you'll find someone who isn't going to rip you off. Rainbow Six Siege is an easy title to run today that's popular. The GTX 1060 still runs at 151 FPS average at 1080p here. So if you're playing games more like Rainbow Six, like League or Fortnite, this card can even hit high refresh targets of 1080p monitors. The GTX 1080 and up would be a good upgrade pathway in a sense, but again, that's if you can find one. That said, an upgrade isn't explicitly needed unless you're seeking an even higher refresh rate or higher performance in other games. At 1440p, the GTX 1060 still holds on at 93 FPS average. This is objectively good performance, but it's weak in a relative sense when compared against just this title. If you're targeting 144 FPS average, a GTX 1080 or better would be a decent option. At 1080p, Red Dead Redemption 2 has the GTX 1060 at 43 FPS average, while running our custom higher settings. This is a challenge for the 1060, but a settings reduction would make it playable. Not great, but playable. The options don't get good until the GTX 1080 and up, and that'd only be worth it in a normal market and at a normal used price. The RTX 2060 isn't far from that level of performance, although the RTX 3060 offers a larger jump from among the new cards. We're looking at about a 111% uplift in the 3060 versus the 1060, which is maybe why some people see the 3060 as great value. But against the rest of the cards on the modern market, like we said in our review, we think it's positioned somewhat greedily, since NVIDIA knows it can sell any GPU right now. 1440p went about as well as you'd expect. The GTX 1060 ended up in unplayable territory. You'd jump to at least a 2060 for some baseline level of quality at 1440p, but the holding value of the 2060 won't be as future-looking as a 5700 XT or an RTX 3060. Horizon Zero Dawn is up next. This one had the GTX 1060 in playable territory at 1080p, and it actually did well enough to hold 60 FPS average with consistent frame times and lows overall. If you're still running a 1060, or if you're looking at a used one, it may be good enough for a little while yet. Primary upgrade options remain the same as previously mentioned. Hitman 2 is next, but this one is severely limiting at 1080. Everything from the 1080 Ti and up is bouncing off of a CPU limitation here, except the 6800 XT. Below that, we have valuable insight for the GTX 1060. This is an older title as well, intentionally brought back to the suite just for this card, and the 1060 does fine. We're mostly proving the point that with older or simpler titles, these cards are still good. They also seem to do okay at 1080p with some newer games, but it depends on which one it is. At 1440p, the GTX 1060 still does okay, but it slips below 60 FPS. There's no doubt that the 60 class of GPUs from NVIDIA has scaled impressively over the years, but so too has the price. We can't give credit to the 3060 for improving as much as it has when so much of that improvement is included with another price hike. So even today, the GTX 1060 really isn't bad for 1080p gaming. It struggles in things like Cyberpunk, but you start looking at Rainbow Six Siege, perfectly fine. And that would follow for Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, or League of Legends, or Fortnite as well. And to that end, the point we kind of always try to reiterate with these revisits of older hardware is if you're using it, and you're happy with it, or you haven't really thought of a reason to replace it until you maybe see new GPU reviews or videos like this, then just remember that as long as you're still happy with the device and you don't have an explicit reason to replace it, there's really no reason to replace it. It's a waste of your money, and it piles on e-waste. And if you do replace it, well, either hang on to it for a secondary computer or find an e-waste recycler to repurpose it for someone else. Normally, they'll try to reuse before they reduce, and that's the ideal way. We work with, for example, Cramden Institute near us, where they'll take older hardware, put it in a system for someone else to use who maybe doesn't care about having high-end graphics, and then it's still useful. But the 1060 today, if you have to buy used, maybe you can find one on the secondhand market near you from someone who has a soul and isn't going to rip you off for $900 for a GTX 1060. If you can find one of those people, then you hang on to them. You can buy one of the cards and get by well enough until the GPU market replenishes. But obviously there's a limit to what's reasonable to spend, and that limit is probably about $100 or less, although that number is mostly pulled out of the air, but just based on the MSRP of other cards, if they were on the market, that's probably where the 1060 should fall. If you're upgrading from a 1060, well, if you're looking used, anything at 1080 and up, so 1080 or 2060 or 1660 type cards, those and up will get you a meaningful uplift. And if you want 1440, then going to a 2060 as a baseline is a good place to start, or an RX 5700 XT if you can find it. And if you want higher than that, obviously 3060 would be a massive jump. It's over 2 times in just the average FPS number, but depending on the game. But it's actually more expensive than the original card was, so depends on where you are today financially versus when you built your system with a 1060 originally. So we're still waiting for lower priced cards to fill the market this was once in. We don't have those yet, but as soon as we do, we'll review them, and hopefully they'll exist. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more, or go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to help us out directly, or buy one of our teardown toolkits on the store because you want to keep your old hardware alive, and that's a good endeavor. We've got a video on that too if you want to see the thermal results before and after and what it means for the performance of old video cards being brought back to life with a simple teardown and reassembly. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.